All right, what is going on, guys? Now, we do a lot of meta-analysis on this channel. We take a look at all of the best decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket, but today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to be taking a look at all of the best decks to play for beginners, people who are new to Pokemon TCG Pocket. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope it's helpful. Let's get right into it. All right, guys. Now, the first deck that we're going to take a look at today is actually Greninja with Druddigon and Tauros. They call this sort of the Bullfrog archetype, and it's a really fun deck. It's really simplistic in its playstyle, and I think it's a great deck for beginners, mainly because it plays no EX Pokemon. That's going to be a theme in this video. Not all of the decks are going to be EX Pokemon free, but a lot of the decks in here are going to be using cards that aren't EX Pokemon. That way, for new players, it might be easier for them to obtain the cards for these decks. The other reason why I might include a deck in this video is because it has a very simplistic or linear playstyle, which makes it a little bit more easy to pick up and play and understand sort of what the, how to go ahead and win matches with this particular list. But this deck is really great. One of the reasons why I love this list is because it actually has a really decent spread or matchup spread across the entire format. The strategy with this deck is we want Druddigon in the active spot to basically stall our opponent to take hits. It has the Rough Skin ability, which basically puts 20 damage on our opponent if they attack our Druddigon in the active spot. So we kind of just let Druddigon sit and hang out in the active spot and be kind of a nuisance, something for our opponent to have to attack and also damage themselves. And then we have, while our Druddigon gets attacked, we are going to evolve up our Greninja on our bench, which has the Water Shuriken ability, which allows us to basically put 20 damage on any of our opponent's Pokemon once per turn. So the combination of Rough Skin and Water Shuriken is really nice. It allows us to do a lot of extra chip damage so that we can come in and use Tauros, who is going to be our attacking option, to do its Fighting Tackle attack, which does 120 damage to EX Pokemon. So it's kind of a counter EX Pokemon deck. But it's pretty simple in its playstyle. Basically, you want Druddigon in the active, you want Tauros on the bench, you want to put your energies on Tauros, and you want to evolve up that Greninja as early as possible. Now, the one thing that we're going to have to make sure that we do with this deck is that we're kind of choosing the right Pokemon to use Water Shuriken on. It's pretty simple to kind of know exactly which Pokemon you should be targeting with Water Shuriken, but that is really the one thing that we want to make sure we're doing correctly with this list. The matchups, or the key matchups for this particular deck, is that we have a tough Gyarados matchup, which does make this deck a little bit tough in the current metagame, but Gyarados has a lot of counters, so it's not that big of a deal. And then we have actually a really decent matchup spread across the board. This deck is good against Pikachu decks and Celebi decks, which are becoming increasingly more and more popular. So, like I said, this deck doesn't run any EX Pokemon. Druddigon can attack in this deck, which is cool. It's another key point that I want to mention is that because Tauros has colorless energy in its attack cost and Greninja has an attack that takes 1 water and 1 colorless, we're kind of free to run the dual energy in this deck, meaning that we can play water and fire energies. And we should get those energies 50% of the time in Pokemon TCG Pocket. You get sort of a random energy to attach, but in this deck we can run where we can kind of play or use fire and water energies. That way we can also attack with Druddigon, which is definitely an upside for this list. We have a lot of room for supporters because we're not running too many Pokemon in this deck. So we have room for 2 Leaf, 2 Giovanni, and 1 Sabrina. You can change these around how you would like. It really kind of comes down to preference. I do think Giovanni and Leaf are really important in here, but you could cut, the X speed for a Sabrina, or you could cut a Giovanni for a Sabrina as well. Sabrina is a really good card, but this isn't a really fast-paced deck, so Sabrina isn't necessarily too needed. Now, some of the sub cards, I put sort of substitute cards, other cards that you could throw into this deck or add to this deck to kind of change it a little bit. I know some new players maybe don't have Druddigon or Tauros. Those are new cards that came out in Mythical Island. Same with Leaf, the Leaf supporter card, but Greninja, I think probably most people have. But either way, you can actually just play Gyarados instead of Tauros for this list. If you do that, you are going to want to play Misties, but if you do that, you're basically playing Gyarados in sort of the most common way to play Gyarados EX, which is one of the strongest decks in the format. So it's really sort of the Greninja and Druddigon package, which is why I put a star on both of those Pokemon, because that's kind of the core package of the deck. You can swap out Tauros for any other kind of attacking options like Gyarados or Mew EX, but really the core aspect of this deck, that core package, is going to be the Greninja and Druddigon, and we have a lot of flexibility in sort of the decks we can build as long as you have that Druddigon and Greninja, put into your deck list. Okay, and here is an example of some other decks utilizing sort of the same kind of package. Again, we can play Gyarados EX with Greninja and Druddigon. It's one of the best decks in the format, but for people that don't have Gyarados, I didn't necessarily want to include it, but Gyarados is exceptionally strong, and of course we're going to run Misties in that list. But the other thing that you can do here is instead of running sort of the Druddigon with an attacker package, we can actually kind of fuse this with the aggro fighting deck, which we'll take a look at in a little bit, that runs Greninja, Hitmonlee, Marshadow, and Farfetch'd, a very sort of aggressive, fast-paced deck that isn't very much different than the original sort of concept here. So here's a couple other variants that we can use to play Greninja or Druddigon that I think are also really, really good. All right, and the second deck that I want to take a look at that I think is really good for new players is actually going to be the Aerodactyl aggressive fighting type archetype. There's a lot of different ways to play this list, but sort of the key components for this aggressive fighting deck is going to be Marshadow and Hitmonlee. These two cards pair very well together. Basically, Hitmonlee is really good against things like Gyarados, basically because it allows you to attack for 1 energy on a basic Pokemon, so you can attack on your first turn going second. You basically just do 30 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon, and against Magikarp, that only has 30 HP, it can be a really good option, but it's just really good in general. Most decks have a lot of Pokemon even from the beginning of the game that they're going to be putting on their bench, so it's a lot of early pressure that we can do with Hitmonlee for only 1 energy. Farfetch'd and Hitmonlee are very common cards from Genetic Apex, and Farfetch'd just does 40 damage for 1 energy to your opponent's active Pokemon, and then when either your Hitmonlee or your Farfetch'd die or get knocked out early in the game, we can go into our Marshadow, which is able to do 100 damage to our opponent's Pokemon as long as they knocked out one of our Pokemon on their last turn. We are a fighting type deck, so we have a really good Pikachu matchup. Marshadow is really good against Pikachu. That 100 damage does actually 120 because we hit Pikachu for weakness, so Marshadow is really good against Pikachu. And then we're running the Aerodactyl, the new Aerodactyl from Mythical Island. However, you can sub out Aerodactyl for really any other card that you have. The Primeape line from Mythical Island is good, as well as just the Marowak line. Marowak is a pretty decent card in its own right, so you could just sort of swap out Aerodactyl for Marowak. However, I do think Aerodactyl is probably a little bit better in this list, but if you don't have it, those are some sort of other options. We'll showcase, or we'll show you a Primeape list here after, but really a lot of these aggro fighting decks are focused around Hitmonlee and Marshadow. It's a really good combination that I think is really good in the metagame right now. It's good against Pikachu, and it's really good against Gyarados, which are two very popular, very strong decks. Now, we do have a tough matchup against Mewtwo, which is one of the other top decks in the format, but either way, I think this is a really good anti-meta pick. Some of the upsides for this deck is that the matches are really fast. Because we're a fast-paced deck, a lot of times we sort of just win early or we lose early, and yeah, so it's kind of good, especially if you're kind of a new player and you want to get a lot of experience early on. It is an anti-meta deck, so it's really good against particular decks that are really high up in the meta, like I said, Gyarados and Pikachu being one of them. And then, as I see here, one of the other upsides for this deck is that you win easily and you lose easily. It's very much a matchup-dependent deck, but because it's a matchup-dependent deck and it's very fast-paced, you're either going to win matches really early on or you're going to just lose matches really early on. It's kind of an auto-win, auto-lose deck. There is some counterplay, but for the most part, its matchup spread is pretty volatile in that respect, but it's very flexible. That's the other upside with this list. We'll take a look at some other examples that are incorporating this sort of, fast-paced, aggressive fighting type package, but I wanted to include this deck because it really is, it's very flexible. It incorporates cards primarily that aren't EX Pokemon, and it's pretty simple to understand. You get your Hitmonlee or your Farfetch'd up in the active early on, you start attacking right from the get-go, and then you have your Marshadow as your backup attacker, and then in the late game, we do have something like a Marowak or an Aerodactyl in the list to kind of be that third Pokemon that our opponent has to go through, which can be pretty tricky because they are EX Pokemon and they have 140 HP. So I really do like this list. It's actually on the rise right now in the current metagame, but for new players, I do think that it would actually be fairly easy to build this deck and fairly easy to pilot it as well. Okay, and here are some other examples of very similar decks. If you don't necessarily have all of the cards you need, there are some ways we can kind of bend this list. So as we see here at the top, that is a Primeape deck list. That is the new Primeape and Mankey from Mythical Island. It's a very good way to play this deck. You could even cut Aerodactyl entirely and just sort of play, Marowak with Primeape, but I think Hitmonlee and Marshadow is really good. And then as we see here, you can actually incorporate Mew EX in here. This deck the bottom one is also running Aerodactyl. That's going to be a common theme that a lot of people are playing Aerodactyl, but like I said, if you don't have Aerodactyl, you can play Marowak, but Mew EX also fits really well in this deck list, and so does Farfetch'd. So those are a lot of different options. There's a lot of different sort of ways that you can play this particular type of deck. You can kind of mix and match a lot of these aggressive, fast-paced cards with some more tempo backup attackers like even a Tauros or a Mew EX or an Aerodactyl, and a Marowak as well. So there's a lot of different sort of flexibility for a deck list like this, but they're all very similar and they all play sort of the same way, and I think it's actually a really great deck for people who are new to Pokemon TCG Pocket. Okay, and what would be sort of a best beginner's deck video if we weren't including, of course, Blane. So Blane's is probably the most popular, early on deck that people play. It makes a lot of sense. Blane's is a very strong card, and there's a lot of cards that work well with it. So the main strategy with this deck particularly is around Ninetales, which does 90 damage for 2 energies. But we have Blane, the supporter card, which allows us to deal 30 extra damage this turn with either our Ninetales or our Rapidash. And we did get a new Rapidash in Mythical Island. This deck list is including that new Rapidash, but it's not necessarily needed. I didn't put a star here next to Rapidash because you can play either the old one from Genetic Apex or the new one. But you can also play the Magmar card, the new Magmar from Mythical Island as well, which also works with Blane. So Blane is a really versatile card. This is a really great deck for new players because it doesn't really incorporate any rare cards, and it does have a pretty good matchup against pretty top decks in the format right now, particularly being Celebi EX. Blane's is always pretty decent because it's fast paced. It hits for weakness against Celebi. Overall, it's a really good card in that matchup, and Celebi is becoming more and more popular. You can struggle a little bit against Executor, which is becoming also more popular in Celebi, but either way, I think we still have a pretty good Celebi matchup. Now, against Mewtwo and other sort of top decks, perhaps like Gyarados, it is a little bit tough to get those wins, but we do have good pace, and we do have Sabrina in the deck, so we do have that potential to kind of win games early on. So again, one of the rare upsides for this deck is that there's no rare cards, but the other upside is that we can beat the best. Blane's is a very consistent deck whose strategy is very straightforward, which means that basically every game we're doing the same thing, and it's not a terrible strategy, and no matter what, even though we aren't necessarily considering Blane's to be a top deck in the format, it can always win against the top decks, which is really, really cool. And like I said, Celebi is becoming more and more popular, so playing a deck that has a good Celebi matchup can be really, really fun, and it is very easy to play. Again, the strategy here is that we want to lead off with our Rapidash or our Ponyta to do some early damage, get that Ninetales set up, hold our Blanes for those big KOs, and then go ahead and just start taking knockouts, doing upwards of 120 to 130 damage here with Ninetales or Rapidash, which can be really strong. The old Rapidash is a little bit better. It only needs 1 energy to attack as a stage 1 Pokemon, and it's a guaranteed 40 damage. You can boost that with Blanes as well. Now, the new Rapidash from Mythical Island does 40 or 60 more if you flip heads, but it takes 2 energy, so it's one of those deals where like it's kind of an RNG type based card. You're not always going to get a lot of use out of it, but it can win you games, so it is pretty interesting for sure. So some of the subcards that I put here, the new Magmar does work with Blanes, and it has a pretty strong attack, 80 damage for 2 energies. That can be boosted by Blane, so that's 30 extra damage doing 110, can be the difference a lot of times, and it's a basic Pokemon, so it's a definitely good card. If you have that, you can slot it into Blanes for sure. There was a Magmar from Genetic Apex, but it's just necessarily, I don't think, as good of a card as the new Magmar, but if you do have that card, you could play it. And as we see here, Kangaskhan is another good card. It's another aggressive, colorless card that we can throw into this deck, which is good early on in the game, as well as Farfetch'd that we'll see here in some of the other examples. But yeah, I just thought that this deck was really important to include in the video because it is kind of the quintessential best set of kind of starter deck in the game. It doesn't require EX Pokemon. A lot of these Pokemon are easy to obtain, and you do have the potential to beat really any other deck in the format, which is pretty unique in this game. And yeah, Blanes, it's not necessarily a top tier deck. Most of the beginner decks aren't necessarily top tier, but it is a really strong deck, and I think that it was definitely worth putting in this video particularly. Okay, and here are some alternate Blanes decks, though. All Blanes decks are going to be very similar. They are most of the time centered around Ninetales with Rapidash and Blane. That's sort of just how the deck functions, but as we see at the top here, we are running the new Rapidash instead of the old Rapidash, so you can mix and match between the two, and then we are running one of the new Magmar, which again is a pretty good option as well. A lot of room for supporters. I think that X speed is pretty important. Of course, we're going to run Pokeball and research in all of our decks. That's probably a theme that you've noticed now if you are a new player, that every deck should include Pokeball and Professor's Research. They're promo cards that you can buy for tickets in the shop. They're not cards that you actually get in packs. So if you were wondering, play those 2 copies of both of those cards in all of your decks. They're just extremely good. At least right now, they're the best option we have for drawing cards and finding basic Pokemon. But yeah, we have a lot of extra room for things like X-Speed, Potion, even Red Card you can play in this list as well. And then down below, we see that a list can include Kangaskhan, which gives it another good option here at the beginning of games. But yeah, it's a very sort of easy to understand strategy, but the thing with Blanes is there's not that much flexibility in the cards that you can play in it. You can't just kind of throw any fire type Pokemon in Blanes. It really should either be a Rapidash, Ninetales, or Magmar. And if it's not, it should probably be Farfetch'd or Kangaskhan. So there's not too much flexibility in the cards that we can add in Blane's, but it is a pretty easy to build deck, so definitely would recommend it for new players. Okay, and the next beginner deck that we're actually going to put on here, and this might be interesting to some of you, is going to be Pikachu EX, and this is particularly Pikachu with Zebstrika. Now, this deck does incorporate quite a few EX Pokemon, but I actually think that it's the perfect sort of beginner EX, or the next step up from sort of a really budget deck, but sort of the first EX starter deck that I kind of would suggest to a lot of players. And the reason for that is that basically every card in this deck that you could run, you can pull from the Pikachu Genetic Apex pack. Pikachu EX is one of the easiest to play, most consistent, and yeah, just good in general cards in the game. I think that there's a lot of different ways to play Pikachu right now, but the Zebstrika variant, in my opinion, is actually the easiest to play Pikachu deck. And it incorporates Zebstrika, which isn't necessarily a hard card to obtain. Now, again, the one thing I would recommend here, and the reason why I put 1 star on Pikachu EX, is because if you don't have 2 copies of Pikachu EX, I really wouldn't recommend playing it, because the main bread and butter of the deck is Pikachu. Most of the time, you're going to be relying on Pikachu to do most of your damage, and I do think that it's very important for you to have at least 2 copies of Pikachu EX. So if you don't have 2 copies of Pikachu EX, you know, it might not be necessarily super worth it to play. You could just use 1 copy of Pikachu, because we are running things like Zapdos EX. We have Zebstrika in here. We also have the new Dedenne from Mythical Island. However, you could swap that Dedenne for Pincurchin from Genetic Apex if you wanted to, but other cards that we could substitute into these Pikachu decks that still keep the simplicity of the deck and don't really make it too much worse are going to be the Electrode card from Genetic Apex, and then the new Electabuzz as well from Mythical Island. Those are both really good options. Now, Raichu is a card, it's sort of a different variant of Pikachu to play it with the Raichu from Genetic Apex along with Lieutenant Surge. The reason I didn't include that in the subcards is because I really kind of consider that a different archetype. It's also a lot more complex in its playstyle and in its matchups, and sort of the playstyle is not necessarily very linear. There's a lot of different decisions in that deck and a lot of different matchups. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend Pikachu and Raichu to new players, but Pikachu and Zebstrika with Zapdos and even Electrode, I would recommend. I think that it's actually a very simple deck. It's a very linear deck, but it's a very powerful deck as well. In fact, this is one of the top 3, top 4 decks in the current metagame, which is interesting because I do think it's a really good beginner deck. It has a great, and I mean a really great, Gyarados matchup, and Gyarados is considered kind of the strongest deck in the format right now. However, the thing with Pikachu and Zebstrika is it does kind of struggle against those Celebi decks, especially ones with Executor, which is something to note for sure. But yeah, this deck has, again, very linear playstyle. It's a very consistent deck. Lightning type is still one of the best types in the game right now. A lot of Pokemon are weak to electric type. Moltres is a fire Pokemon, weak to electric. All of the water Pokemon are weak to electric, and even Zapdos EX itself is weak to electric. So it's a very powerful typing in the game right now. And now here's the thing with Pikachu and Zebstrika is because it is probably one of the most consistent decks in the entire game, you always have a shot, right? Even in matchups where you don't necessarily have a good matchup against the deck that you're playing up against, you still have a pretty decent chance to win that game because Pikachu is just such a consistent deck. The matchups that are bad for you aren't never like that terrible, because likelihood is that we actually are playing a more consistent deck than our opponent, even if our matchup isn't necessarily that great. Okay, and here are some alternate Pikachu decks that I think are actually quite good. So as at the top here, we see that instead of Zebstrika, we're actually running Electrode. I think that Electrode can be swapped for Zebstrika. I don't think it's as good in the format right now, but like I said, if there's ever a reason why you don't have Zebstrika, but you do have Electrode, you can plug in Electrode and just be totally fine. And then here at the bottom here is actually quite interesting. If you don't have Zapdos EX, what we can do is actually play Zebstrika along with Raichu, and then we can play Lieutenant Surge in the deck basically to kind of help bolster up that Raichu, and it gives this deck a really interesting sort of float option. There's a lot less basic Pokemon in the deck, or basic Pokemon that we would use, meaning there's no Dedenne, no Zapdos. We are kind of relying on Raichu and Zebstrika on our bench, which are both evolution Pokemon. So it is sort of a very interesting way to play Pikachu, but in fact, this Pikachu deck here with Zebstrika and Raichu ended up actually, I think, winning or getting a really high placement in one of these really big Pokemon TCG Pocket tournaments. So it actually might rise to prominence. So if you don't have Zapdos EX, there is actually a really good way to play Pikachu if you have Raichu and Zebstrika. But Pikachu, it's pretty simple to understand, particularly with Zebstrika, and I think that it's very consistent, and it's a really good deck for new players. Just make sure that you probably get 2 of those Pikachu's EXs But again, you can get most of the cards for this deck in that Pikachu EX pack from Genetic Apex. So I would really recommend doing that, especially for new players. I think it's probably the best deck to start with as far as EX Pokemon go. And the last deck that we're going to take a look at today is actually going to be really the only dark type deck in the metagame right now, but I also thought it was a really good inclusion. One, because it's a great anti-meta pick right now. Mewtwo is a super popular deck, and Scolipede and Weezing is probably the one deck in the game that hard counters Mewtwo in a lot of different ways. So Weezing and Scolipede is a really strong combination. You can include Tauros in this deck like we see in this particular example, but really one of the core examples of this deck, and I didn't forget to put a star here in terms of sort of the core Pokemon of this deck, but really the core Pokemon I would say would be Weezing and Koga. That's really its own package. Weezing basically allows you to poison your opponent's Pokemon with its ability, and then it only has attack for only 30 damage, but only 1 energy. That does 30 damage, but the cool thing is that Koga, we can scoop up our Weezing out of the active spot and put it right into our hand, basically full healing it, and then we can again just put it right back and play onto our bench. So it's a really strong archetype. We pair it with Scolipede, whose Venoshock attack does a lot of damage to our opponent's Pokemon if that Pokemon is poisoned, which again, we will be poisoning with Weezing. Weezing's actually a lot better now with the inclusion of Leaf, the new supporter card from Mythical Island, which reduces your retreat cost by 2. It makes it a little bit easier to get Weezing out of the active spot. And yeah, so it's a really strong deck against Mewtwo because we are hitting for weakness, and we are completely comprised of non-EX Pokemon, so it should be fairly easy for people to build. And yeah, very strong Mewtwo matchup. However, the problem with this deck in the metagame right now, and the reasons why it's not necessarily a top contender, is because it really does struggle against other top decks like Gyarados EX, but it is a very strong anti-meta pick right now, and should be pretty easy to build. Now, there is a new Weezing from Mythical Island, but I would not recommend to play that Weezing. It doesn't poison your opponent. Kind of the main upside to playing Weezing is that it has a 1 energy attack cost, the one from Genetic Apex that is, and it has the ability to poison, which kind of or bolsters or improves the attack damage from something like a Scolipede, but also the Muck, as we see in our sub cards. The Muck card from Genetic Apex is very similar to Scolipede. It's better in some ways, but worse in some ways. I think overall Scolipede, the whole Scolipede line from Mythical Island, is a better option, but Muck is still pretty good. So if you wanted to run a dark type Weezing deck, I think that Muck is a really good option as well. So consider that one upside with Muck is that it actually works with Koga as well. We can pick up Muck from the active spot, which is pretty good for sure. But yeah, so no EX Pokemon in this deck. It's a really good anti-meta pick. Mewtwo really is kind of the top deck of the format right now, and the only hard counter to Mewtwo is going to be Weezing and Scolipede. Mew EX is really good against Mewtwo as well, so that is another option, but overall, I would say that Weezing and Scolipede is kind of that next best option, I guess, to counter Mewtwo EX. Mew EX actually fits really well, so if you do have a copy or two of Mew EX, you can kind of throw it in Weezing decks. We'll take a look at those alternate versions of the Weezing decks for sure. But yeah, it's very good going first as well, which is a big upside. There's not a lot of decks that like to go first because typically being behind on an energy isn't good in Pokemon TCG Pocket. We want to be the one to attach energies first. That way we're technically a turn behind from energies. But things like Weezing and actually Whirlipede are good going first. Once you evolve, you can attack for 1 energy, and they both poison your opponent and do a little bit of chip damage. So they're both good options actually going first, which is a pretty significant upside for this deck. But yeah, and it's actually pretty simplistic in its playstyle. Basically, you want Weezing in the active spot, you want to poison, you want to start attacking. If your Weezing ever looks like it's going to get KO'd, or if we need to bring in Scolipede to KO our opponent, we just hold on to our Koga or our Leafs, and then we play it, move our Weezing out of the active spot, and then we go into our Scolipede or our Tauros to basically take those KOs, and then we can kind of recycle that whole process, go back into our Weezing, poison our opponent, do some chip damage, and then go into maybe our second Scolipede or our Tauros, like I said. So it's a very easy to understand matchup, and it's good going first, which again is not a lot of decks can say that in this format right now, and it is certainly an upside for this deck list. All right, now let's look at some other examples of Weezing decks that are also pretty good and totally viable in the format right now. So at the top here, we actually see a deck with Muck and Grimer. Now, since basically we're running Muck and not Scolipede, we have 2 extra cards in our deck to fill in, and this player or the player who built this deck actually chose to play 1 Dredagon, while also including an additional trainer like Giovanni or Sabrina. And I actually do like this list. Again, Druddigon is another great card. Druddigon with Tauros is just really good in general. It's a really good Pokemon to just kind of sit into the active spot. So I actually like this deck here as well. Again, all non-EX Pokemon. But if we look below to the second list, we actually see Weezing being played with Arbok. Now, Arbok doesn't benefit from the poison much at all, but it is a really good counter pick to Mewtwo. So this Weezing Arbok Mew EX deck is actually like the Mew EX's worst nightmare between Weezing, Arbok, and Mew EX, all good cards against Mewtwo. So if you want to play an anti-Mewtwo deck, and a lot of people are playing Mewtwo, and a deck that's overall not bad in the format in general, I actually think that Weezing, no matter how you're playing it, is actually a pretty good pick. I would highly recommend that if you're going to play Weezing, you're going to want Koga to go with it. It makes the deck that much better, but also the new Leaf card from Mythical Island also makes Weezing that much better as well. So I would highly recommend having Leaf to put into this deck list. But anyway, guys, that's going to wrap up this video. Now, here's the thing. If you're new to this channel, if you're watching this video, you probably could be new, since it's sort of a video tailored towards new players and beginners. I would really enjoy it, or I would really recommend that you guys subscribe to the channel. We do a lot of informative content here, and we're basically trying to help everybody become as good as they can at Pokemon Pocket and be as informed as possible about, you know, all of the best decks and how to play the game and how to build decks. So I think it's really fun. Pokemon TCG Pocket is a great game. The community is massive, actually. The game is still growing, and it's exceedingly popular right now. So again, I really, really enjoy making these videos. So I would really appreciate it if you guys would stick around, like the video, subscribe. It means a lot to me. Stay tuned. We're going to have more videos coming in the future. Tomorrow is actually Monday, and on this channel we do a video series called Meta Monday, where we're going to take a look at the current metagame, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit about what decks are on the rise, what decks are on the fall. It's going to be a great chance to get an overall landscape of sort of what the metagame looks like for Pokemon TCG Pocket. So stick around for Meta Monday tomorrow. It's going to be a good time. I would really recommend it. But anyway, guys, thanks so much for watching. I've been Maddie. Have a great day, and we'll see you guys next time. Peace out.